Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Uncommon Sense live stream. I'm Joshua Barnes, and I am joined by Steve Tendon and Ian Heptinstall, who is our guest host today. Ian is here. He's going to talk about Agile Project Management as a method has two constituent parts, which will be the lead-in into the discussion that we're going to have to be able to share with everyone today. And Steve, why don't you take it away and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, friends of Herbie. So I always start like that because I am keen of bringing the knowledge of theory of constraints with Herbie to the masses. And I think this will be a topic that even Ian is interested in.
And Ian, if you want to introduce yourself and get us going today.
Hi all. Thanks, Joshua. And yes, I'm sure I can manage to be interested for another hour, at least, Steve. But I'm certainly looking forward to the chat. As an academic at the UK's University of Birmingham, I teach project management to working project managers early in their career. So not to recent graduate students, but to people who are actually working on a project and are looking to get insights and knowledge and approaches to thinking about projects that will stand them in good stead throughout their career. As I said in the bio, my background is several steps removed from the Agile and Agile project management community that you guys and many of the people on the call this evening will be more familiar with. My kind of projects are building stuff, building physical stuff, manufacturing factories, chemical plants and petrochemical, pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities early in my career, hospitals, infrastructure, roadways later on. So I'm interested in getting your thoughts from a couple of perspectives, one of which is generally about project management. And then there's secondly a way to test my understanding, maybe misunderstanding, wrong preconceptions about what Agile is or could be. Because I'll have to admit, when I first came across the idea of Agile, and this was in the early 2000s, publicity around the Agile Manifesto, I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, something new in the field. I went to have a look at it, and I remember thinking, is that it? Isn't that what projects do? Isn't that just generally good project management, other than the few software-specific terms? But they were quite easy to translate into my domain. And then I sort of left it at that, thought, well, there's something for software people to worry about. But in the coming up to 20 years since the Agile Manifesto, there's been quite a significant movement amongst the project management communities, a growth in the sort of the presence, the visibility, the number of people who are talking about Agile, and the success stories. So certainly as an academic teaching in this field, I felt duty bound to find something out about it. And I've come up with a couple of hypotheses and ideas that I'd like to get some thoughts and feedback in. But firstly, a question to you two, Joshua and Steve. Waterfall, the arch enemy of Agile. Did anybody really manage projects in the way that Waterfall's described? It seems a made up, like the devil. Religion needs a devil to be anti everything that we're for.
Well, I don't know if I remember the story correctly, but I think it was in the late 60s or 70s where at some conference, probably with some military background, Walker Royce wanted to describe how to conduct projects in a correct, good manner, as you would say, Ian. And I started off this paper by giving like the counter example of what you should not do, and that was this thing with Waterfall. And all people read those first few pages, but failed to read the rest, where he was giving the solution.
Right.
So that became like the archetype that Walker Royce was proposing to do this Waterfall thing. And then I really don't know if people really did Waterfall, because even to me, it seems so nonsensical that I cannot figure that someone is really doing Waterfall. Yes, I know in classical project management, we have many methodologies like Prince2 or the old Ericsson props or others, where you have staged gate constructs. But those are mostly done due to the nature of the projects that are being handled. It's not in the sense that the current like agile framing does of Waterfall, that you decide everything once and for all, and then no matter if the sky falls, the earth burns, you will stick to that plan and never change it. That just does not make sense. So I'm quite skeptical that Waterfall has ever been done by anybody as the enemy as it is depicted.
Mm. Yeah, and first off, I would like to before I chime in, I'm going to say that I think Ian has actually experienced Scrum to some degree. And if we can pull up, Ian had sent a picture. If we can pull that up, yeah. So this is what it's like to experience Scrum.
Yes.
In real life, and so maybe we won't comment too much on how many people experience that using Scrum and the way they deliver their value. But yeah, and so Steve, to your point, as far as Waterfall, and it might have been Walker Royce that wrote that paper, because, or Winston Royce, because
Winston, yes,
Winston, because Walker Royce then carried on some of the evangelism of iterative development through the Rational software company that was ultimately acquired by IBM, right?
Correct.
But yeah, I would say that if you think about the waterfall process and compared to Agile, and Ian, you said 20 years ago Agile just looked like some good things that project managers did, but how do you get early feedback? Right? How do you get that with a waterfall project where you're bound by these long phases before you have anything to really show, other than in some cases stacks of documents?
Because the only time that a project looks nice and neat with blocks of activity that are followed by another neat block of activity is when you write the presentation about it after the event. Because when you go through it, when you're doing early stage feasibility design, you've got somebody with an idea that they investigate, and then they say, oh, this idea isn't as good as I thought, let's try another one. There are 3 different ways that we could that seem favorites to do this. Let's explore each of them a little bit, and then water it down to 2 or to 1. It's only with hindsight that you say, well, here's what we decided to do. Yes, we did. And the sort of blinkered, unexperienced, deterministic member of senior management might easily say, what were you wasting your time for? Why didn't you come up with that idea at the beginning? Well, to me, it's like you've got a field full of rocks and there's a pot of gold under one of them, but it's random. So all you can do is lift a rock up and see if there's gold underneath it. Now, at the end, some smart aleck can stand and say, well, why didn't you pick that one up first? Because we didn't know where it was to start with. So for me, all projects have always been like that. And that's why I say, did anybody actually try and manage a project and say, oh, the market for this product has totally changed, but we've started, we're going to carry on doing it. In my experience, even though we had a nice Gantt chart, and if you put the expected sequence, you had some tasks that were early and some that were later. And if you put them in the right order, they look like steps. And some will overlap and some will go end to end. And you could say, well, that looks like a waterfall. Yeah, but that's just a graphical tool. When the distinction between agile and non-agile of things like you've got hard sequencing. Well, my understanding is you don't code software until you've got a user story, and you can't do testing until somebody's coded. So there is a hard sequence, even in a 2-week sprint, that might address different user stories. They still need doing in a particular sequential order, and I could draw them out after you've done them, showing how long they took, and they'd look like a nice little cascade.
They would, but that might be a team that has an opportunity for a lot of improvement. And I'll give an example of, because this comes up a lot, right? Iteration, sprints, whatever. They're just mini waterfalls, and that might be bigger than a big waterfall. But here's the thing: so if you have a story, let me step back for a second. So in a typical waterfall project, you're going to have a team, but that team isn't really functioning like a team because you have a lot of really specialty work that gets kind of handed off to the next specialty work, right? So you might have testing that's done much later in the life cycle than when the requirements gatherers were doing their thing. But if we say in a agile, especially an iterative agile approach, and we're going to do work within a 2-week time box, say, well, what we want to strive for is saying, well, we have a story, and that story had met a level of readiness and understanding and discussion. It's got acceptance criteria as we're entering into that next time box planning event, right? So the team is formed, and we have all the skills and experience, at least from a development and a testing perspective. So as that story is pulled from the backlog and brought into that next time box, we would want to have the people with that QA testing experience to, identifying test cases and writing test scripts and automating testing while the code's being written, right? Which is not a mini waterfall, so that by the time we are ready, somebody can step in. It could be somebody with testing experience, it could be a developer, depending on, again, if we're seeing that we're getting a little backed up. I won't talk about bottlenecks or constraints because I'll let Steve chime in on that. But so we don't want mini waterfalls even within these small time boxes, sprints, or iterations. We want to be doing the work more concurrently so that we get away from that. And it is hard to do that when we're taking a waterfall or serial approach, because again, the way we're getting the capacity of the team members that would have those skills and the typical setup of testing environments and getting test data and all of that, there is typically a lot of sequencing with projects. And I guess the last thing I'll say to let Steve chime in is we also probably need to take a look at some projects using a waterfall approach might be done very effectively using a waterfall approach. And there are some projects that are scopes of work using a waterfall approach that are just dreadful, right? That they are very phase gated and they are you're going to do a certain specialty amount of work up to a point, and then it is a handoff, at least in my experience.
So we must make sure that we are comparing apples and oranges, and strawberries and cucumbers and watermelons, because this is what we're getting at. We in the software world, because software is so the lever, the economic lever of software is enormous, because a team of 5, 6, 10 people can create a product that is worth billions. So the tendency is to say, well, we are a $1 billion industry, and that is true. And you might compare this with other hard industries, like the ones that Ian is experienced in, which are also $1 billion industry. But there, the effect is different. There, to get to those volumes, you don't get away with 10 people. You might need 4,000 people to get all the things in place. And 4,000 people cannot work in in 2 weeks iterations. Yes, there are extreme cases of like what's the name, the Wikispeed, those who were building a car in a Scrum fashion, but that's more an exception of a proof of concept rather than what is the normal practice of the industry. So when you have these different nature of the projects of the domain, combined with the number of people or quote resources, as they say in project management, and the Agile folks get upset by the term, and this is another conversation. Right. But when you have those numbers, they must be managed in a more structured way. And yes, the feedback loops are really the essence of performance. No matter if you're doing Agile or these more structured, I don't want to use the word Waterfall, but the more structured conventional project management works, the tightening of the feedback loops become of essence. So if we want to make the connection, and here I also want to hear Ian, one of the key strengths of TOC in project management with critical chain project management and the use of what is called the buffers, but I don't like the term buffers because I think it's more like a signaling system, is that you get early leading signals of where you should focus your attention. So it is a feedback loop that is constructed in the method rather than in the practice of having 2-week time boxes. And what I did in recent year was to take that notion of having feedback that comes from the work, from the state of the work, rather than from the cadences that are arbitrarily chosen, brought that thing to the domain of knowledge work and software engineering. So I think that's where one needs also to understand that in software the iteration, the time boxed iteration is artificial. It's arbitrary. What matters is the natural rhythm of divergence and convergence of knowledge to produce the next increment. Now that could be 30 minutes, or it could be 3 weeks or 3 months. It depends on how hard the problem is. So I also have an issue with time boxing because I don't think it's the most effective way of creating the proper feedback loops. Now, within the iteration with this divergence and convergence, what becomes of essence is, and I always go back to this because this is the huge difference between software and non-software projects, are the interactions. And interactions when you have software are in 3 dimensions. One is the person, the user with respect to the software, and that provides feedback. The other one is well, when we're speaking about systems, software to software interactions, and then you have like the system where all this is embedded that also interacts. Now, interactions are the key element that distinguishes software. Why? Because there is this Wagner's lemma, which tells you it's mathematically proved that you cannot have the correct information of whether the software is evolving, is developing in the right direction without interaction. And mind you, this is not the inspection after the fact. It is the interaction during the actual construction of the artifact. It's as if you were mixing concrete, and the act of stirring around the pot, or what you call it, of concrete, gives you an indication of whether the house you want to build with it is going to stand up or not. I don't think you have that quality of interaction in hard projects. But I know Ian has lots to say here.
Yeah, maybe not. But I think any project of any scale is a complex system, a complex adaptive system where you've got chance and fortune, and the success is dictated more by the interactions between the parts than the parts themselves. And any project team is of that nature. You don't know who's going to talk to whom, who's going to be too busy, what ideas are not going to come up in 3 weeks' time. And I think that there may be a difference between software and what you call hard physical projects, Steve, at the detail level. But I think that generality about interactions, early in my career when we were building chemical plants, yes, you've got bits that come together, concrete, steelwork, piping, machinery, some of which is static machinery, some of which moves. And those machines are designed by one type of engineering expert, but they need to interface with other engineering experts to make an integrated system. Just like designing an automobile, you can't just get a bag of parts, to take the famous Russell Acuff example. You can't take the best components, put them together and expect them to make a great car. And making a manufacturing asset that not only has to meet some expected production rates to make a product, it needs to be maintainable for 5, 10, 15, 25 years. It needs capable of safely and appropriately being decommissioned at the end. It needs to be operated safely. Those operating things need taking account of, but very often the people who've got the expertise in doing a big project have got no idea how to operate. So the right teams in that kind of projects always had to be integral. And I think something that triggered when you mentioned the W word again, waterfall, Joshua, that clearly Steve's been well trained, because I actually think some of the terms and analogies like that the Agile community adapted have been more damaging to project managers like me coming to have a look, because we've missed the important bits. Call a silly name like Waterfall, and whenever anybody tries to explain what it means, when there's any substance, that's what I would call just general bad project management. You know, working functional teams independently of others, expecting them to do all their work before they pass it over. If we're to draw out a sort of key general characteristic, we should be looking at the sizes of batches of work that are passed within teams. Now, there's one element of batches of work, which is the completed work. And maybe in a software environment, you can have updates every day, every week. So you can actually update a marketed product in small increments. You can't really sell houses that way. Nobody wants a kitchen one day, and then they're quite happy when you add a bathroom a few days later. So there's a minimum increment that makes sense in the market. However, within the project, the idea of moving work forwards to sequential activities in small batches. Now, I think that's a core element that we're certainly building into our education, because it gets lost within the branding, but it's generic. Steve mentioned it fuels fast feedback. It fuels rapid, continuous improvement, plan, do, check, act cycles within your project team. You know, you shouldn't have a 6-month task that people say we plan it at the beginning and we do it and we follow that through. I've never known that. We start and say, we think this is the best way of doing it. Let's have a go. And then let's see if it works. Let's tinker with it. Let's make it better. You know, when I was running projects, I was hoping that when we came halfway through a particular phase of activity, we should be working much more effectively and productively because we'd learned as we'd gone along and we'd got smarter. So we sort of break our learning into small batches. So I think that's one of the things that, as Steve said, Agile builds in, but doesn't always explicitly mention it. But is key when you look at there's a concept that came out in, I think, the 80s known as the rework cycle. I think it was associated with the folks who coined the fictitious man month or whatever it was, that showed that when large projects get late, throwing more resources simply makes them later.
Right.
Because the people who've got the inherent knowledge about that project are then being stopped doing work to induct and to train the new resources. So the progress and the productivity gets less and less and less as you throw resources at a problem. But the whole idea of the rework cycle is that any project type activity has work that people think is done, but there's a proportion of errors in there. And the longer it takes you to find those errors and act on them, the worse it is for the overall project. And something like small sprints helps you to naturally get your rework cycle feedback happening very, very quickly. It all happens within days within that team because you've got a multifunctional team in the room doing stuff. But if anyone thinks that other projects building chemical factories don't have cross-functional teams sitting in there and don't have representation from the ultimate owner or customer for the project, then that's just not the case and hasn't been for decades, if not centuries. You know, the Starrett brothers, when they built the Empire State Building, worked cheek by jowl with Roscoe and Smith, who were the developers. They didn't let a contract and then say, over to you, contractor, we'll see you in court if it doesn't work. No, they looked alongside each other. They changed stuff as they went along. They started building before even they'd managed to get the building code in New York changed to allow the use of modern steel, which was critical to making the building as tall as it was. You know, they took some risks, and they knew they took risks, and they made changes as they went along, but they kept those bits of feedback short. And actually, they had some great burn up and burn down charts as part of the inherent methodologies in 1929, 1930. They weren't computerized; they were done in pencil and ink. So.
You know, you mentioned something that interests me quite a bit. You mentioned about house building, right? So that's obviously much smaller than building a massive facility. And I had the opportunity to work with a home builder, and it was a sizable home builder that did a lot of what we would consider here to be like spec homes. You know, they had like a dozen blueprints, and then they had modifications to make the facade look a little bit different. Yeah. But they were moving more into doing custom houses and slightly different customer. And they were running into some problems where there were a lot of change orders and missed expectations and stuff. And so anyway, it's whether it was good project management practices or mediocre ones and predictive, traditional, serial, sequential, waterfall. I'm going to try and put a whole bunch of words together so it's not just waterfall. And there was a desire to say, well, if we change the way we do things and we can kind of bring that in from what you guys are calling an agile perspective. And I'll give just two examples that we worked on in sort of a initial like project scope to try and test some of this with this company. One of the things that they realized were their canned lights. You know, so at least here in the States, you know, depending on the type of house you have, you know, the more pricier houses, you know, they have a lot of canned lights. And those lights look very different if you're in a 15 by 20 room with a 12-foot ceiling or 10-foot ceiling versus a very open floor plan that might be a 50 by 70 room, right? Because you're looking at it from a different angle. And what they were finding was their standard can lights, or the 3 or 4 they would put in, oftentimes were missing people's expectations because visually they were looking at it from an angle and they didn't like it. So what we did was we had, once, you know, there was enough of the construction that was ready for them to put a little drywall up in a certain spot of the house, and they put up a number of lights to get feedback, right? Way before they would have ever have done that. They just ran some temporary wiring and put some can lights in. And that way they were able to minimize a lot of rework and scrap that they were seeing later on. Another thing in this particular house, because of it was a lot of windows, and the homeowner had this vision in mind as far as the pool, and you could almost see through every part of the house. It was on a pretty good sized piece of property. So they actually created some temporary supports to put some of the windows that the architectural designs had in it up so that the stakeholder could look through them at various angles and realize that either was or wasn't what they were expecting to see. So that's something, though, that I would say, at least again in my experience, that no matter physical construction project, you know, non-physical, you know, software project, we don't see a lot when we consider these more traditionally run projects, that there might be prototyping, but there isn't mechanisms or practices in place to get that type of feedback and then action on it.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. But that to me is an example of good and bad project management. Integrating, you know, the belief that all the aspirations and the wishes and the needs of whoever's seen as the client can be expressed on bits of paper, and then made even worse once you put contracts in place. Right. You know, those make projects difficult and risky and poor quality. I fully agree. You need that fast feedback, and actually something that you know, I would have said that what you were doing there is what would be called BDUF, isn't it? Is that right? BDUF, big design up front. in that, okay, you're using prototypes, but you're getting the user input. It's hard to visualize what the light will look like. You might be able to simulate it with some sort of 3D visualization tool these days, but not if you haven't already got that infrastructure. But yeah, mocking it up with gaffer tape, basic wiring, slinging some up. Which of these do you like? And from a planning point of view, the key question is, when's the time at which it makes a big or a little difference if I change my mind? Right. And then very often there are certain projects where what I call the relative cost of planning and delivery. So there are some projects where planning and delivery are about the same. So it's almost pointless putting too much time and effort into doing the design at the planning. You may as well take it through to delivery, and if it doesn't quite work, you can change it. You know, quite a bit of software works like that. Even though I'm not coding, you know, I'll have a go with Excel and I'll see if it works. I'll think, got it wrong. I'll debug it. Let's fix it. Because sort of, it makes no real sense putting all the effort into getting the design right on paper or in a different tool and then translating it. Yeah, we can take the prototype all the way through to production and easily change it. But there's other types of projects where the relative cost of planning and delivery is the other way around. Planning is much cheaper than delivery. If you've got the weld thickness of the next Boeing jet wrong, it's too bloody late when you discover it, you know, on the test flight. That's the sort of thing you want to have BDUF. You want to do the simulations and the stress analysis on computers and get it all right before you invest billions in manufacturing something of a size. And it's the same with ships and bridges and big physical assets. But that's not, for me, that's not a different project management methodology. It's inherent in the thing that's the subject of the project. And a project manager should have the flexibility to say, not, when I last built the space shuttle, we did it this way, so this totally different project should be done the same way. Yeah, one simple tool is that, well, in this environment, what's the relative cost of the planning and design work and the delivery? If it's high, I might put more effort into upfront getting it right on paper before we move into execution, like many capital type projects. If it's the other way around, it might be easier for us to get through to something that looks finished and tweak it and change it at the end. But projects come in all those flavors, I think. But I'd like to pick up on something you triggered with the housing developer. And the UK might have quite different approaches to housing than the US, but the predominant method here is a building company will also be the developer. They'll find some land and they'll plan it to build, say, 100, 200 houses on that land, and they will build all the houses and sell them. So we're not a market where people buy building plots and then they go and find a house to go on it. That's a tiny proportion of the UK. Most housing is major developer builders. Now, what they do for a large project, 100 houses, they get some outline planning permission, but they sell in small batches. They work out what an MVP or a minimum sellable, not necessarily viable, but a minimum sellable quantity. So they release the 100 houses, say 5 at a time. And they get feedback from the market to see what seems to be selling, what doesn't seem to be selling. They don't decide which houses will sell right at the beginning. They put some in for the outline planning permission. They have an idea, but they're more than happy to change when they get feedback from the market. So they'll sell 5. They'll see one type of house seems much more popular than another. They'll increase the price. They'll potentially increase the quantity. So, all right, we were planning to do 8 of design A. No, we're going to put 12 of design C because they're selling like hotcakes and giving us more gross margin per square meter of estate. So that to me fits exactly in my interpretation of a sort of agile approach to incremental product, getting feedback from the market, feeding it back to the next bit. But that's how big housing estates have been built in the UK for decades and decades, to my knowledge, certainly since I've been in the market. As I say, it's good practice. It's not being invented.
It's definitely similar here, where we do have home builders that do the same thing, 100 houses or 1,000 houses. Some of the developments are huge. But we do also have, custom houses again, the builder that I worked with, they were moving more towards custom because there was a much bigger profit margin in custom, and there was a lot of that. I know Steve, it looks like he had something to chime in, but one last thing I'll say is, as you mentioned, the project manager should have the option through good project management practices to select how they would run the next project based on the context of that project, and that's not always the case. And I would agree. And the best example I've seen was a very large contractor that had a boat that I saw. And so the dinghy, which was called Contracts, right? The name Contracts on the back, which was a very nice boat in itself, was a teeny tiny little boat compared to the massive yacht that was called Change Orders.
Yeah.
So they also had a good sense of humor, but that is one of the ways that really stuck with me, that yes, contracts and change orders.
Yes, a well-known truism. but as I say, certainly in the infrastructure and many other industries, the way that we procure and contract gets in the way of doing good project management practice. To the extent that which, as far as I understand, major public sector government, they almost use the word project and contract interchangeably, as though all there is to doing a project is to define it, let a contract to a single main contract organization and get them to deliver it. Now that to me is more like project abdication rather than project management. In fact, that's just triggered another sort of part of my hypothesis, that is a lot of the good that's come out of Agile and Agile Project Management are great tools for managing what I would call work packages.
Yeah.
Not a project. Now, if I look even at software, for me, a software project will include marketing, branding, customer communication, sales, as well as programming. The project is all those bits. There's a work package which is translate as many of these things on a wish list into real working, reliable software as you can in a period of time. But I would expect in a software company that's just part of making money. You don't automatically make money by releasing the code. Somebody's got to think about pricing it. So somebody's got to do all the PR and marketing so that customers are crying out for this and they're willing to actually pay for it rather than expect it as a maintenance upgrade, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, the project is that wider thing. And we were chatting before we sort of switched on the stream today, because I think that I see all around the world, that what's seen as project management has become, and by many is defined as, delivering something that somebody else has decided to do, almost doing what you're told. That's not my sense of project management. My project is the more holistic one. It's and very often in the early stages, a well-managed project will decide this isn't worth doing. There's no reason to do anything. Many organizations should initiate more projects than they develop up into deliverable schemes, and those should be a greater number than they actually end up doing. It seems to me that if you treat a project as delivering something which needs project management skills and capability, you're sort of missing a trick. And I sense quite a lot of that in the Agile environment, where people say, well, we need to have the customer involved. Well, of course you do. You mean people didn't? Now, if you're a contractor, they often are not involved. And many contractors only make money by ignoring the ultimate customer or doing the opposite of what they want. But that's not their fault. That's the fault of the commercial contract that has been used to engage them.
Yeah. So, what you're calling a project in one of the things that in at least the DA value stream management perspective, we call that a minimum business increment, where it's not just the development work we're looking for, it's software development. It's all the work that it is to deliver value to a customer. And then I know in addition to that, in TameFlow, Steve has lots that he's covered with that. And so Steve, why don't you share a little bit of what you have in TameFlow as well?
Well, I reckon totally what Ian said there with the work package, and in fact, the packaging mechanism is almost similar to DA's MBI. I call it the MOVE, the minimal outcome value effort. So the minimal amount of work effort that you need to produce to generate an outcome or a value, presumably both. An outcome always has some sort of value. So that is very, very consistent, and this way of reasoning can be applied not only to the software engineering activity proper, but also to all other stuff that must happen. Anytime you set off to do something, you have in mind an objective, a goal, if we want, and you have in mind some amount of work that you want to realize. Maybe, sorry, saw some dogs barking outside here. They want to join the show as well. Maybe you need to do even some exploratory work, but then that can also be packaged in terms. Well, in Agile, you would do a time box. I do not agree that time boxes are the right thing, but I would reason more in terms of how much are you willing to spend to gain the knowledge about whether you want to proceed or not. So it's still limiting the amount of work, but in terms of expenditure, not in terms of timing. Now, I had a question for Ian, but before I really must go back and comment on the interactions, because this is really, for me, the key about, let's say, the original Agile and the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, I include the evolution of Agile, because the original Agile was exclusively about software development. The Agile Manifesto, the first word is about software development. Nowadays, Agile has become more of, let's say, a holistic management philosophy rather than something that focuses on software proper. But let's for a moment go back to the interactions, because the interactions that you mentioned, Ian, in the complexity sense of the interactions between the parts are not what I was referring to. The interactive part comes from the nature of software, and software has a very nasty thing that you don't have in the physical world, and it's this notion of incompleteness. You have it in math as well with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but in software you have this fact that you are using 0 and 1s, so it's binary, and therefore there are certain numbers that do not exist in the software world, and all software is built on these numbers. So to make an example, if you were to build a house and you need to have some architectural element, a rod or something that is, I don't know, 1 meter long, you will have some tolerances. It could be 0.999 or 1.0001, and it's still good. You have a range of things that are acceptable. Now imagine that you're constructing this rod, and the length turns out to be a number that does not exist. The rod cannot exist. So that is the big deep difference with physical world. And in order to be able to prove that the artifact that you have built, the artifact that you have coded, the only way is to resort to interactive problem solving, proving that the stuff is what it's supposed to be. Yeah. There is no formal way to do it. There is no way to measure it. So the interactivity comes as a necessity to resolve the problem. It's not an option. And I think that changes everything.
Well, I was understanding there's a continuum. The only point I was making that when you build, say, a chemical factory, you've got elements that you are hoping will work together in a particular way. You're controlling it with a control system, which is going to have software, it's going to have sensors, it's going to have unpredictable error rates, it's going to be interpreted by human beings who will have the ability to override certain parts of it. So I'm not saying it's the same as software, but I'm saying that the sort of world of project is not binary. It's not a 1 or a 0. It's not that there's a whole middle ground, and large projects that have to last a long time, have humans working them in an unpredictable way, have their own variation on that theme of complexity. Was all I was saying. Steel is steel. There's deterministic equations you can use to calculate them, but a chemical factory is not just steel. It's the way all the bits come together, the ability for somebody to put the wrong stuff in at the wrong time. in an unpredictable way. So probably something for another day. I think you had a
I don't agree that it's unpredictability. No, yes, it is unpredictability, but it's not the same thing. Funnily enough, one of the justifications of Scrum comes from the use of empirical process control in chemical factories. So that was one of the inspirations of Scrum. That's why they say that it is empirical process control. And that's one kind of feedback loop, but it's not what I'm referring to. Even in the chemical factory, where you have all sorts of surprises, Mr. Murphy, and who knows what else, it is as if you had a chemical factory that's in a tank that can hold a certain volume of gas or whatever it is. There are certain amounts of gas that cannot exist. There is a discontinuity in the number. How many software products have had problems because they were trying to do like real numbers, floating point numbers?
Yeah.
They have. It's been ages that problem has been addressed. Now there are techniques to do that, but still that like highlights what the core problem is. It's a matter of not being able to represent symbolically in the code that you're doing the things that you need to reason about. And the only way to discover if you're getting close to the target is this inspection. But Ian, I had a question because we're running out of time, and I must ask you this question. Mm-hmm. Where does the theory of constraint come in your world of projects?
The short answer is in two parts. First, if I'm looking at what you might call the planning, the development phase of a project, deciding what to do, clarify why it's being done, and work out what it is you want to do. In that environment, I think some of the structured thinking processes of TOC are very powerful facilitation tools for working with the core project team, the wider project team, and key stakeholders to surface, verbalize, and to sort of clarify a range of things, from why the project is being done, what current issues are we hoping that the project itself will overcome, are the proposals likely to overcome them. So that's at a strategic level, all the way through down to a day-to-day level for resolving conflicts. I think most conflicts in human relationships are actually misunderstandings. But of those that aren't misunderstanding, then the TOC simple tool of a cloud conflict resolution diagram is a great facilitative way of sort of depersonalizing the clashes that you get. The sort of clashes that happen on a rugby field, as we saw early on. As somebody who plays rugby, by the way, I think it's very strange that this environment has picked up a range of rugby terms like scrum, like line out, that are actually quite aggressive, sneaky, cheaty things. It's two sides, one trying to really beat the other in aggressive competition, working within and beyond the rules, as we saw earlier on. The other thing in rugby, there's something that's allowed called a handoff. Now, in the USA, a handoff is quite a pleasant thing where somebody passes a bit of work to the successor. In the UK, that's handover. I'm handing it over to you. A handoff in rugby is if somebody tries to tackle you, you're allowed, in effect, to push them in the face. With not with a straight arm, but you hit them bent, and then you straighten the arm, and it can be fantastic done at speed. And if you mistime it, it can hurt. So that's another thing. Whenever I hear somebody saying, I'm going to hand it off to you, that's again quite an aggressive thing to do. But anyway, coming to one side, the other tool for TOC in my kind of environment is the one with the use of critical chain project management. and that fits in actually with my comment earlier on about Agile being a set of techniques for managing work packages that they're suitable for. Okay, if it was designing software, if it was something else, as you said, Steve, in the early stages of the project, if we're not sure which option to follow, I might set up some time-bound little sprints. You team go and look at option A, you look at option B, you look at option C, and we'll come back in 3 weeks and decide which one. I'm time-bounding it. At that stage, my cost is my resource. It's an option. Within the critical chain approach to scheduling, as you certainly know, Steve, the philosophy is don't try and be more detailed than your current knowledge. Something so-called Waterfall project management has known for decades. The idea of rolling wave planning was about, we've no idea what we will need to do in 6 months' time, so let's not detail it until we get closer. We can't detail the structure until we've done some design to decide whether to make it out of steel or concrete. It's pointless guessing. So that critical chain, I think, is a great way for giving a project level overview, which comes from theory of constraints, but within it, managing the flow of actual work can depend on the type of work. And tools like yours for knowledge work with Tameflow, the use of similar ideas of drum buffer rope. If it's a simple work package, get the team round a board and put some columns and move post-its across them. What I can't see is why a project would have all the work packages done in exactly the same way, because the work at the detail level is inherently different from each other, and that needs to be encouraged. And I think that's one of the good things about critical chain. The other things in our sorts of projects where theory of constraints comes in is the cross work package flows, where information flows not in the sequential Gantt chart, but sort of goes off early in design. There's a data sheet that needs procurement, that needs somebody to start making. And then later on, all these materials start flowing onto a very busy construction site. You've got to decide where to hold stock, where to hold inventory, when to replenishment, how to make sure you don't run out. That is also not something that's discussed in many project management textbooks where TOC can help. I know I'm coming up against time after that long answer.
Yes, we have a deadline.
Well, Ian, it was great having you join us today. And I do want to say that Ian has a book called The Executive Guide to Breakthrough Project Management, outlining how a combination of collaborative contracting and critical chain scheduling provides a foundation for improved value delivery. So if you'd like to get a little more insight into some of Ian's experience and thoughts, consider checking his book out. And Steve, if you want to talk about Tameflow in your book and some next steps.
Yeah, I always, since I'm redesigning the whole book, I really invite people to get the early draft because I want feedback. Now, what we said before, the feedback loop, the book is going to evolve in new directions. So as I publish the new chapters, they will come out on LeanPub. You will get the notification. Read the new stuff and give me feedback. So you find it on leanpub.com/Tameflow.
And unfortunately, Al Shalloway, Al wasn't able to join us today, but Al will be back with us next week for another exciting session of Uncommon Sense. Ian, any parting words from you?
No, other than I think the key learnings for me about Agile that need building into the body of knowledge: scope, time, quality, and cost are variable. Projects where the scope can vary are different from projects where time and cost can vary. Small batch sizes, speeding up feedback and the rework cycle is always going to be a good thing, as is simple, visible progress management. Plan, do, check, act. Those are some of the nuggets that were hidden in Agile that took me years to uncover, because I was put off by the waterfall word.
The waterfall word.
We'll never use it again.
Good. Okay, guys. Thanks for meeting me. It's been good fun.
Thank you. And thanks
Thank
everyone
you.
for joining us. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.